Hi, I'm Blake Lively, and I'm going to be taking the BuzzFeed quiz, which iconic Blake Lively character?
Hi besties, welcome back to the channel. Lars Harry here, and today we need to talk about something that has quietly surfaced in the background of all the chaos surrounding Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively. While most of the headlines have been focused on Hollywood drama, lawsuits between celebrities, and the ongoing media battles tied to projects like It Ends With Us, another legal issue has been quietly moving through the court system, and it involves a serious car accident in Manhattan that could potentially cost millions of dollars. According to court filings, Ryan Reynolds, through one of his companies, is now facing a lawsuit seeking up to $5 million in damages. The situation centers around a car accident that happened in the spring of 2024 in New York City. At first glance, the case might appear ordinary. Traffic accidents happen every day in Manhattan, but the deeper you look into the details, the stranger the situation becomes. The lawsuit does not initially name Ryan Reynolds personally as the driver. Instead, it targets a holding company connected to him, specifically the entity that owns the vehicle involved in the accident. But when you dig into the accident report itself, it becomes clear that the vehicle involved was actually registered to Ryan Reynolds. That detail is what ultimately pulled his company into the legal battle. Let's go back to the beginning so the timeline makes sense. The crash reportedly occurred on March 2, 2024, early in the morning at around 7 a.m. It was a Saturday, and the location was the intersection of West Street and Watt Street in Manhattan, an area not far from the Tribeca neighborhood where Ryan Reynolds has a well-known apartment. Many people jokingly refer to that residence as his version of a palace in New York because of how luxurious and private it is. At the time of the accident, a Tesla owned by Ryan Reynolds was being driven by one of his employees. The driver was later identified as Olivia Felipe. According to the records, she was traveling southbound along West Street when the collision occurred. Now here's where another layer of the story enters. The other vehicle involved in the crash was not just a normal private car. It was part of a service known as Access-a-Ride, a transportation system designed for individuals who cannot use traditional public transportation. In New York City, Access-a-Ride provides rides to people with physical disabilities, cognitive challenges, or medical conditions that make buses and subways difficult or impossible to use. Instead of navigating crowded subway platforms or busy buses, these individuals can call the Access-a-Ride dispatch system. A specially contracted driver will pick them up and transport them to their destination safely. On that morning in March, one of those vehicles had picked up passengers and was traveling through Manhattan when it encountered the Tesla driven by Reynolds' employee. The Access-a-Ride vehicle was owned by a private operator based in Brooklyn. The company contracts with the broader public transit system but operates its own vehicles and drivers. According to the documentation, there were 3 people inside the vehicle at the time of the crash, the driver and 2 passengers. One of those passengers would later become the plaintiff in the lawsuit, an individual named Taji Toki Kelly. According to the complaint, the Access-a-Ride vehicle was traveling southbound in the left lane of West Street. Meanwhile, the Tesla driven by Reynolds' employee was traveling in the middle lane, moving in the same direction. The report states that the Tesla suddenly changed lanes, moving directly in front of the Access-a-Ride vehicle. After merging into the lane, the Tesla allegedly stopped abruptly before reaching a traffic light because the roads were wet and the maneuver happened quickly. The Access-a-Ride driver was unable to stop in time. The vehicle collided with the rear of the Tesla. In other words, the Access-a-Ride vehicle rear-ended the Tesla, but according to the complaint, that happened because the Tesla had cut into the lane suddenly and then stopped. The accident caused visible damage to both vehicles. Photographs taken at the scene reportedly show bumper damage on the Tesla, while the Access-a-Ride vehicle suffered more extensive damage to its front bumper and hood. Interestingly, there was no full police investigation conducted at the scene. Instead, the event was documented through a standard accident report. And another detail that later became important, when the incident happened, the driver of the Tesla did not provide personal identification information. According to the complaint, the driver did not hand over a driver's license or personal contact details. Instead, she only provided documentation related to the vehicle, specifically the registration and insurance information tied to the car. Those documents listed Ryan Reynolds as the insured owner. Because of that, it took time for the parties involved to determine exactly who the driver was and who was legally responsible for the vehicle. Eventually, investigators and attorneys traced the Tesla back to 2382 Walker Holdings LLC, a company connected to Reynolds. That discovery led to amendments in the lawsuit, Adding the company to the case as a defendant, now here's where the legal side becomes complicated. In many car accidents, liability falls on the driver. But when a vehicle is owned by a company, or when an employee is driving it as part of their job, the owner of the vehicle can also be held responsible under certain circumstances. That's the argument being made in this lawsuit. The plaintiff claims that because the Tesla belonged to Reynolds' company, and because his employee was operating it at the time, the company can be held responsible for the consequences of the crash. The complaint states that the collision occurred due to negligence on the part of the Tesla's driver. It further claims that the defendants, including Reynolds' company, were negligent in the ownership, operation, supervision, and control of the vehicle, but the central claim in the lawsuit goes beyond just the accident itself. The plaintiff alleges that they suffered serious and permanent injuries as a result of the crash. Under New York law, that phrase carries a very specific meaning. To pursue damages beyond what is covered by no-fault insurance, a plaintiff must demonstrate injuries that meet a legal threshold for seriousness. This can include permanent disability, long-term impairment, disfigurement, or injuries that significantly impact a person's ability to work or live normally. The complaint references legal statutes such as CPLR 5102 and 5104, which define the types of injuries that qualify for additional compensation. The plaintiff claims that their injuries meet that threshold and that their economic losses exceed the limits of basic insurance coverage. In simpler terms, they argue that the crash caused damage severe enough that standard insurance payments are not sufficient. Because of that, they are seeking damages that could total up to $5 million. What makes the situation particularly interesting is that the request for $5 million was already part of the case before attorneys confirmed the vehicle belonged to Ryan Reynolds. In other words, the claim amount wasn't suddenly increased once a celebrity name entered the picture. The demand was already there based on the alleged injuries. That detail has led some observers to believe the lawsuit is not simply an attempt to target a wealthy public figure for a larger payout. Instead, it appears to stem from the medical and financial consequences the plaintiff says they experienced after the accident. However, the legal battle is far from straightforward. Multiple parties are involved, and each of them is attempting to shift responsibility elsewhere. On one side you have the plaintiff, the passenger who claims to have been injured. On the other side are several defendants, including the driver of the accessorized vehicle, the company that owns that vehicle, the public transit authority connected to the accessorized program, and Ryan Reynolds' company as the owner of the Tesla. Each side has begun presenting arguments about who is actually responsible for the crash. The transit authority has already suggested that it should not be held liable because it merely facilitates the accessorized program but does not directly control the independent contractors who operate the vehicles. Meanwhile, the companies involved with the accessorized vehicle argue that they were simply operating within the system established by the transit authority, and Ryan Reynolds' company has taken the position that if any liability exists, it should be shared among all parties involved. This kind of finger-pointing is extremely common in complex accident cases. Each defendant attempts to reduce their own financial exposure by arguing that someone else bears greater responsibility, and that brings us to another important legal element in this case: comparative fault. Under New York law, a jury can determine what percentage of responsibility each party holds for an accident. One party might be found 10% responsible while another is found 90% responsible. Damages are then divided accordingly. So if the jury eventually decides that Reynolds' company bears only a small portion of the blame, the financial impact could be significantly reduced. But if the evidence shows that the Tesla driver's actions were the primary cause of the collision, the company could face a much larger share of the damages. At this stage of the case, the lawsuit is still moving through the discovery process, where both sides exchange evidence and gather information about what happened. Medical records, accident reports, witness statements, and expert testimony will all play a role in determining the outcome. One of the key questions that will likely be examined is how severe the plaintiff's injuries truly are, because when lawsuits reach the level of multi-million-dollar claims, courts typically expect evidence of life-altering damage, things like permanent disability, severe physical impairment, or long-term loss of income. The plaintiff's legal team will need to demonstrate exactly how the accident changed their life and why the damages they're requesting are justified. Meanwhile, the defendants will likely challenge those claims and argue that the injuries are either less severe than described or were caused by other factors. And as the legal battle unfolds, another layer of the story begins to raise questions about timing, circumstances, and the broader Context surrounding Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively during that same period, because while this lawsuit was quietly progressing through the court system, several other major controversies and financial pressures were unfolding around them at the same time, and when you start lining up those timelines, the situation becomes even more interesting. So now that we understand how the accident happened and why Ryan Reynolds' company was eventually pulled into the lawsuit, the next part of the story becomes even more intriguing when you start looking at the timeline of events and what was happening around Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively during the same period, because while this accident occurred on March 2nd, 2024, the lawsuit itself was not filed immediately. Instead, several months passed before the formal complaint appeared in court records. That gap is actually very common in serious injury cases. When someone is hurt in an accident, especially if the injuries are significant, the first step usually involves medical treatment and insurance claims rather than immediate litigation. Under New York's no-fault insurance system, the insurance associated with the vehicle involved typically pays for initial medical expenses and certain economic losses regardless of who caused the accident. This system exists so that injured individuals can receive treatment quickly without waiting years for a lawsuit to be resolved. In this situation, it appears that the plaintiff first went through that process. Medical bills were reportedly submitted and covered under the no-fault system, which suggests that treatment began soon after the crash. But the no-fault system has limits. It only covers a certain amount of medical costs and lost wages, and it does not compensate someone for long-term pain, permanent disability, or major life disruptions. That is where lawsuits like this one come in. If a person believes their injuries are serious enough to exceed what the insurance system covers, they can file a lawsuit seeking additional damages. That seems to be exactly what happened here according to the court filings. The lawsuit was formally filed in October of 2024, roughly 6 months after the accident occurred. That timeline fits with the typical pattern seen in many injury cases. During those 6 months, the plaintiff likely continued medical treatment, evaluated the long-term impact of their injuries, and consulted with attorneys about whether further legal action was necessary. When the complaint was filed, the plaintiff alleged that the accident caused severe and permanent personal injuries. That phrase is extremely important because it signals that the legal team intends to argue that the injuries meet the threshold required for damages beyond the no-fault insurance limit. But there was another complication that slowed things down even further. At the time of the accident, the Tesla driver did not provide full identifying information. Only the vehicle documentation connected to Ryan Reynolds was given at the scene. That meant attorneys had to conduct additional investigation to determine exactly who owned the vehicle and which company entity was responsible for it. Because of that, the lawsuit reportedly went through multiple amendments before the final list of defendants was established. Eventually, the investigation connected the vehicle to 2382 Walker Holdings LLC, which is the company linked to Ryan Reynolds. Once that connection was confirmed, the company was added to the complaint. This is where the legal battle really begins. When a lawsuit like this is filed, each defendant has the opportunity to respond. They can deny the claims, challenge the allegations, or file motions asking the court to dismiss the case entirely if they believe it has no legal basis. Interestingly, in this situation, Ryan Reynolds' company did not immediately move to dismiss the case. Instead, the legal response involved a set of affirmative defenses. These are legal arguments that essentially say, even if the plaintiff's story is partially true, there are other reasons the defendant should not be held fully responsible. Some of these defenses are standard in accident cases. For example, one argument suggests that the injuries might have been worsened if the passenger was not properly secured by a seatbelt. Another defense raises the possibility that the other driver may have contributed to the collision by failing to maintain a safe stopping distance. These arguments are not necessarily admissions of fault. Instead, they are strategies used by attorneys to ensure that every possible defense remains available as the case moves forward. Another key argument raised in the responses focuses on shared responsibility. The defendants argue that if any liability exists, it should be divided among all parties involved in the accident. That includes the driver of the accessorized vehicle, the company that owns that vehicle, and possibly even other entities connected to the transportation program. In other words, everyone involved is pointing fingers at each other. The accessorized operators suggest that they were simply performing a contracted service and that the accident occurred because the Tesla cut into their lane. Meanwhile, Ryan Reynolds' company appears to argue that the accessorized vehicle ultimately struck the Tesla from behind, which traditionally places responsibility on the trailing driver. Cases like this often turn into complicated legal puzzles where accident reconstruction experts analyze vehicle positions, braking distances, road conditions, and witness statements to determine what really happened. And remember, the road was reportedly wet that morning, which could play a role in how quickly the vehicles were able to stop. But while the legal battle over fault continues, another part of the case remains particularly significant: the claim of permanent injury. When a lawsuit seeks damages in the millions of dollars, the court will expect detailed medical documentation. The plaintiff will likely need to present records showing hospital visits, diagnostic tests, physical therapy, and long-term medical evaluations. In cases involving permanent injury, expert medical witnesses are often called to testify about the lasting effects of the accident. They might explain how an injury impacts mobility, daily activities, or a person's ability to work. Sometimes these cases involve spinal injuries, traumatic brain injuries, or conditions that require lifelong treatment. The legal process to evaluate those claims can take years, which is why this lawsuit is still moving slowly through the system. But what has caught the attention of many observers is not just the accident itself, it's the timing of everything else happening around Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively at the same time. Because when the lawsuit was filed in October 2024, the couple was already dealing with several other controversies and financial pressures around that same period: disputes connected to film production issues, brand challenges, and corporate investments were making headlines. Business ventures tied to both Reynolds and Lively were facing scrutiny, and some projects were encountering setbacks. Ryan Reynolds is not just a Hollywood actor. Over the past decade, he has built a complex network of business ventures. These include marketing companies, sports investments, beverage brands, and entertainment projects. Managing all of those businesses means navigating constant financial risks. At the same time, Blake Lively has also launched multiple lifestyle and beverage brands. When public controversies hit celebrities who operate major brands, the reputational impact can ripple into their business partnerships and investor relationships. This is why legal disputes, even those unrelated to entertainment, can sometimes attract intense public interest when celebrities are involved. Another layer of speculation comes from the fact that Reynolds is also involved with a professional football club, which requires significant investment and ongoing financial commitments. Sports ownership often involves large capital expenditures for stadium upgrades, operations, and player development. Reports have also circulated about financial complications affecting some of the ventures connected to Reynolds' broader investment network. For example, losses linked to financial institutions or business restructurings can sometimes force investors to adjust their financial strategies. None of these issues automatically mean someone is experiencing financial distress. Wealthy individuals often operate dozens of ventures simultaneously, and fluctuations in investments are normal. However, when multiple events happen close together, a major lawsuit, business controversies, and high-profile public disputes, people naturally begin to examine the broader picture. Some commentators have even speculated about whether certain legal actions taken by Reynolds and Lively during that period were partially influenced by financial strategy or reputation management. Those ideas remain speculation, of course. There is no confirmed evidence that connects this accident lawsuit to any other legal actions or business decisions, but the overlapping timelines have certainly raised eyebrows among observers who follow celebrity legal battles closely. What we do know is that the $5 million lawsuit remains active. The case has not been dismissed, and the parties involved are still navigating the legal process. Discovery, depositions, and expert testimony will likely determine how the case develops. At some point, the court may decide whether the transit authority can exit the case entirely through summary judgment, leaving the remaining defendants to resolve the dispute. It is also possible that the case could settle before reaching trial. Many personal injury lawsuits end in negotiated settlements once both sides understand the strength of the evidence. Settlements can save years of legal costs and eliminate the uncertainty of a jury verdict, but until that happens, the case will continue moving forward quietly through the legal system. What makes the situation unusual is how little public attention it received for so long. Considering the celebrity name connected to the vehicle, it's surprising that the lawsuit remained largely under the radar until recently. Now that the details are becoming more widely known, people are beginning to ask questions about how the case will unfold and whether it could eventually become a larger public story. Will the court determine that Reynolds' company bears significant responsibility? Will the other defendants succeed in shifting most of the liability elsewhere, or will the parties reach a private settlement before the case ever reaches a courtroom? Those answers may take time. For now, the lawsuit stands as another complex chapter in the ever-expanding world of celebrity legal drama, one that began with a rainy morning in Manhattan and a sudden lane change that may end up costing millions. And with that, besties, that's the full breakdown of what's happening in this case right now. I'm curious to hear what you think about it. Do you believe this will eventually go to trial, or do you think a settlement is more likely behind the scenes? Let me know your thoughts.